On this week's episode, we fled across the desert, but a gunslinger followed.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxietymonkies podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? What a lovely Saturday it is!
A couple of quick notes, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I apologize for not doing an episode last week. My voice was just shot. You could barely hear me, so I decided not to do an episode at all. The second thing is that you might notice an improvement in the audio quality of the episode. We managed to score a new microphone, so we've kind of upgraded the studio. Achievement unlocked, I guess. So that's it for housekeeping. I guess we'll move on. So there's a quote that I really like that comes to us from the Supreme Court. I forget the name of the justice in question, but he was basically working on an obscenity case, and the question of hardcore pornography was kind of at the heart of this case. And he basically said something along the lines of, I'm not going to try to define what hardcore pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And that's the phrase that's kind of stuck with me. I know it when I see it. By itself, it's kind of banal. There's not a lot to it, but in the context, it just kind of cracked me up. And that's where I was on the subject of villains. I didn't necessarily know what makes for a good villain, but I know it when I see it. So I went and did some digging to kind of see what other experts might say on the subject. You know, what makes for a good villain. So I found a few things, but before I get into it, Michelle, do you have any thoughts on what makes for a good villain?
We all know the term villain, and we know that villain is defined as somebody that does something wrong. I guess you can say the villain could be defined by the individual. Even in our current situation, some people don't view Donald Trump, for instance, as a villain, where others feel that he is almost as bad as the Joker. So it's more of an individual point of view than anything else, unless we're dealing with law, where the law is defined, and if you break the law, you're considered a bad guy or a villain.
Okay, so that kind of gets into a couple of different things. First of all, who defines who a villain is in real life? You know, there's public opinion, there's the law, the judicial system. There's also, the individual themselves. I mean, I think a lot of people would prefer to see themselves as the hero of their own story. So in real life, I think it's more of just a series of shades of gray rather than something that's black and white. I'm sure there's a few individuals that we can all agree on, but this being 2020, even then, I'm not so sure that applies. Like, you and I would definitely consider Hitler a villain, but he's a darling of the alt-right, even if they don't come out and say so explicitly. They're definitely, worshiping him behind the scenes. So I did some digging. I looked at what some quote-unquote experts in the literary fields have to say on the subject of villains, and they came up with a few criteria, and I'm going to kind of run through them, and we'll kind of see whether we agree with them or not. First of all was one that I kind of touched on, self-awareness. Do we need villains who think they're the good guy? Now, arguably, I think that might make for a more realistic villain, but I can think of a few cases where the villain in question hasn't bothered to consider, are we the baddies? Or if they did stop to consider it, they might just unapologetically own it. Take Joffrey Baratheon, for instance. Here's a little asshole who's basically completely lacking in redeemable features. There's nothing about him that I can think of, either from A Song of Ice and Fire, the books, or Game of Thrones, the television series. There's nothing about him where I can look at him and go, oh, well, there's a moment where he isn't a complete shit stain. So I don't know that self-awareness is necessarily vital to the development of a good villain.
Now, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. On the shows, in the beginning, Joffrey wasn't a complete asshole. In the beginning, he was still sort of in the middle. He was great. He wasn't a complete asshole.
Well, and I think...
And as they developed the character, he became more of an asshole. It was more of what he experienced.
Is it, though? I mean, it could just be that he had enough self-awareness to recognize that the kind of monstrous behavior he engaged in when he's at home isn't the sort of thing you do when you're in public.
Now, see, for instance, through the whole show, you can see that, okay, he's teased, tormented, picked on, he's acting like a spoiled brat. And because of those actions, he feels he's entitled or maybe has a right to act the way he does.
Sure, because nobody really steps up and stops him during, like, his formation. Like, there's a period of time where he goes from being the prince to becoming the king of Westeros. And until Tyrion shows up and tries to rein in his bad behavior, there's this evolution where he just gets more and more and more monstrous.
And so could it be said that he became what he became because of bad parenting?
Oh, yeah. Bad parenting definitely factors into it. And there's the question of, is he just born evil? That's more of a moralistic question. We know he's the product of incest. So, maybe it's a mental thing, like genetic psychopathy. So there's definitely something wrong with him. It's a nature versus nurture sort of thing. And I think that's a little more in the weeds than I really care to go.
And then, well, if we're touching on the subject of Games of Thrones anyways, it slips my mind what his brother's name is. Tomlin, yeah. He was a completely different character.
Sure. Completely different character, but similar upbringing. They're both the product of privilege.
But he was not teased and tormented as Joffrey was.
I don't know where you get the idea that Joffrey was teased and tormented. Joffrey was the one doing the teasing and tormenting.
But, if you think about it, they showed Tyrion teasing him, and they showed some other people teasing him as well, and he just got upset with it.
Yeah, but that I wouldn't rank that as like the sort of thing that turns somebody into a complete psychopath. A little hazing from the family. Maybe it's just my environment, the way I grew up. There's a level of hazing that's just kind of normal. Me giving crap to my younger siblings, there's kind of like a line that you don't cross, where if you stay on the other side of that line, everything's okay. I don't get the impression that Joffrey was teased, tormented, bullied, that he didn't go through enough crap to really justify what he became. Not that there's really any level of crap that a person could go through that would justify what Joffrey became.
And I think he was more revenge-driven, too.
Oh, yeah.
Joffrey was.
Definitely a heightened sense of what justifies revenge in his mind. Embarrass him just a little bit, and he will cut your fucking head off.
He carries it to a new arena.
Yeah, he carries it to...
you start off in baseball, and he carries it to football or to jousting.
Or he grabs the baseball bat and beats you to death with it. Like I said, not much of a sense of humor with this guy, and just a heightened sense of what justifies revenge in his mind and what that revenge looks like.
And where Tomlin was more of a critical thinking person, and more understanding and just willing to think things out, to think things through.
Yeah, but that might also have something to do with his home environment as well. He's a younger sibling, and his older sibling is a monster. If I had a sibling like that, I would probably get really good at trying to be as invisible as possible, because I would not want to attract his attention. But again, we're getting a little kind of out of depth here and kind of onto a sidetrack. I guess the question is, A, has there ever been a point in Joffrey's life, you think, where he maybe took a look at what he's doing and tried to evaluate it? And B, does he consider himself the good guy in his own narrative?
In his thinking, he is the good guy. Everybody's gotten things that they've deserved in his eyes. And I don't think he's ever looked upon the things he's done and regretted it.
Okay, fair enough. So the next category that they've got is achievable goals and realistic means. Or to put it another way, a stick-up guy isn't going to take over the world. One example that comes to mind is Lloyd Henreid from The Stand. Here's a guy who had been a stick-up artist and eventually gets into spree killing, but for him to really see true evil, he has to pair up with Randall Flagg. And once he does, he takes part in some pretty monstrous things, but he's never like the ringleader. He's never the guy who decides, hey, let's crucify people along Interstate 15. Then there's the question of a backstory. For heroes, a backstory allows us to identify with them. It shows that they have human roots, no matter what heights of greatness they may achieve later on in their arc. But for a villain, is it really necessary for us to know where they came from and what made them the person that they are when we encounter them? Now, we talked about Joffrey Baratheon earlier, and part of what makes him kind of an enigma is that we don't know what made him the beast that he is when we encounter him in the books or in the TV series.
And granted, when you bring up Joffrey, we don't know his history. But when we compare the Joker, for instance, we're a little bit more familiar with the Joker's background. And we have a better understanding of how he was created.
Well, we didn't get that, though, until fairly recently. For the longest time, the Joker was a character, depending on who was writing for the series, who would show up, do some pretty nefarious stuff, and it was basically just understood, oh, he's irredeemably insane. It wasn't until they did, I think it was called One Bad Day, where they finally put together an origin story for the Joker. And I won't spoil that for the listeners, but you might want to check it out. I've noticed that there's been kind of a trend in comic books lately where they finally started giving origin stories, characters who didn't have one to begin with. The Joker comes to mind, as I mentioned. There's also Wolverine. They did an origin story for him. So I think a backstory maybe makes the characters more relatable, but I don't know that it's necessary because, again, Joffrey Baratheon and the Joker are a couple of examples of characters that stood on their own well enough without a backstory for quite some time.
Yes, they are strong characters. But that deeper understanding of the character adds something to the story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I just don't know that it's 100% necessary. The other thing that a villain is supposed to need is that they're supposed to be on scale with the hero. The idea of Batman beating the crap out of shoplifters doesn't really have the appeal of him taking on iconic villains like Two-Face, the Riddler, the Joker, the Scarecrow. But that also kind of raises a question about Batman that we may want to explore in a subsequent episode. The idea of a billionaire beating the crap out of people with mental illnesses maybe isn't as heroic as we'd like to think it is.
Now, my question for you is, if we're comparing people with mental illness and everything else, could we tie Iron Man to Loki?
I don't think so. Again, you've got a billionaire in an invincible beat everyone's ass suit, but I don't see Loki as being mentally ill. I see him as being truly villainous. Here's a person whose motives are basically aggrandizement at the cost of everybody else. So, from any rational perspective, the guy's a villain.
So you don't think Loki suffers some form of mental illness?
I don't, and I'm not really comfortable with the trend of assigning every bad guy.
Oh no, I'm not saying every bad guy.
I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying that there is a trend, both in real life and in fiction, of trying to diagnose everybody who's abnormal, everybody who goes against, societal norms, trying to cast them in the light of having a mental illness. And I don't think that's necessarily a good look either. It's easy, it's easy enough to decide as a writer, well, I'm going to make this guy, he's a serial killer because he's a psychopath. He's got some sort of mental illness, and that's going to be good enough. And I think it's a cheap, easy way out, and it does a disservice to those with legitimate mental issues. So, I guess that's kind of where I stand on that. And finally, the thing that a villain needs is an air of invincibility. They have to appear, at least initially, insurmountable. Joffrey Baratheon, again, is another good example of that. By himself, he's, a 13-year-old boy. If Robb Stark had shown up at King's Landing, the fight between him and Joffrey would have lasted about 3 seconds. But he's got armies at his command. He's got the Lannister bank accounts backing him. He's got influential lords willing to do his bidding. So right up until the end, there's a real question of how the hell do you stop this creep? And on that note, I think we're going to take a little break for a message from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's P-A-I-G-E-S, printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. Just a quick warning, folks. This next segment is going to feature some pretty heavy content. We're going to be talking about death, murder, suicide, mutilation, and sexual assault. So if any of those things are an issue for you, you may want to skip this segment altogether.
Also, a warning that in this segment, we are going to be talking about the Gunslinger series. And in this segment, there are going to be spoilers. So if you want to read the book, you may want to skip this segment as well.
Now that raises a bit of a side question. The last book in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King was published in 2012, so it's been out and available for 8 years now. I guess the question is, how far out do you have to do spoiler warnings?
Well, keep in mind that there are people who are similar to you who have a mile-long book read list and may have just not gotten to it yet and want to get to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfectly valid, but at a certain point I have to acknowledge that if I haven't read something or seen something that's been out for quite some time, that's kind of on my own head. And if I stumble across spoilers, again, that's kind of on my own head as well. I'm pretty good at avoiding spoilers for things that I may want to partake in that I haven't actually done so yet. Like we've been talking pretty heavily about Game of Thrones. When season 8 came out, I basically decided that I wasn't going to watch the episodes week by week, that I was going to wait until the entire season came out and then binge them all. So when my two coworkers would talk about the episodes, I knew, hey, it's time to go over, put my earbuds in, and bear down on whatever work I happen to have at the time.
But hey, if you're still listening, you've chosen to go down this path and follow the gunslinger into the desert.
So that brings us to the villain that I want to look at this week. He goes by many names: Randall Flagg, Walter O'Dim, Martin Broadcloak, and a bunch of pseudonyms with the initials RF, and I'm not going to try to list them all because we'd be here all day just listening to that. But yes, we are talking about the Man in Black. So the Man in Black was inspired in part by Donald DeFreeze, who was involved in the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. He showed up in the poem The Dark Man in 1969. I haven't actually read this poem yet, so I don't know if he was given a name at that point or if he was just kind of a nebulous figure. It seems to me that when Stephen King rolled this character out, he did so in kind of a bitwise fashion. A piece here, a piece there. But the first official appearance was in The Stand. When we first encounter him in The Stand, he's walking down a road with a backpack full of pamphlets for various organizations, the KKK, the Weather Underground Society, and basically we establish his modus operandi pretty early on. He thrives on chaos. He thrives on trying to cause the downfall of civilizations. And he's never the principal mover in these situations, but he's like the power behind the throne. He's not the guy leading a meeting where they're talking about bombing a courthouse, but he's the guy who would show up at a meeting where they're maybe planning a protest, and talk of the protest quickly turns to bombing a courthouse, if you get my drift. So he basically serves as the foil to Mother Abigail, the Satan to her Christ-like figure. And he uses his supernatural abilities to terrify and amaze his followers. One instance of this is when he helps to release Lloyd Henry from the prison that he finds himself trapped in the aftermath of the super flu. Another example is when he shows up to kill Bobby Ray. Now, a little backtracking here. So this is a character named the Judge, and he's been sent to infiltrate Flagg's base in Las Vegas to collect information for the people of the Boulder Free Zone. The Judge gets his information, makes his way out, and it's only after the damage is done that Flagg figures out there's been a spy on my base, and I need to do something about this. So he stations guards at various places where the Judge might try to make his way back east. And in one of these places, You've got a couple of guys playing poker for real money, just kind of sitting out the rain and watching the situation, waiting for the judge to come through. And sure enough, he does. They take out high-powered rifles and shoot the judge, including popping a round off in his face. And one of the things that Flagg had told them was to explicitly not shoot the guy in the face because he wanted to send the judge's head back to the Boulder Free Zone. So Bobby Ray shoots the judge in the face, the judge dies, and Flagg shows up in the form of a crow who transforms into a humanoid figure, and he, basically kills Bobby Ray. So a lot of great power there, a lot of, interesting abilities, but it seems kind of a waste to use them in the fashion that he does. It also seems kind of limited in that he doesn't use these abilities to stop the judge in the first place. Now, one of the interesting things about Flagg is that we don't get a whole lot of background information about him through his own perspective. There's a little bit, yes, but most of what we know about him, we know from the dreams that the characters have. We also know through a hypnosis session involving a character named Tom Cullen. One of the strengths of The Stand is that the character development is pretty strong, but Flagg doesn't really grow other than in his power. He doesn't grow as a person. I wonder if this was deliberate decision on Stephen King's part. The other thing that I kind of notice about Flagg is that, okay, he's the big bad in the series, but he doesn't strike me as like a Hitler type character. He strikes me as more of a Mussolini. He gets the trains running and stuff, and that was one of the appeals that Mussolini had to his followers, was that he was getting Italy back on the right track at the time. The other thing to kind of consider is that Mother Abigail thinks that he's literally Satan. But if he's literally Satan, he's kind of underwhelming. You look at the beast in Revelation and all the abilities that, Satan's supposed to have, the Antichrist is supposed to have, and he's kind of underwhelming. What does he do? He rules by fear. He rules by terror. He crucifies people who disagrees with him along I-15. He puts the bodies out for other people to see. Not exactly eldritch horror type stuff. One of the other things is that the banality of evil is kind of a reoccurring theme in this book. There's also this kind of phenomenon where he achieves the zenith of his power, and then it all starts to just slip away from him with no real explanation. He becomes increasingly unhinged. His followers start to abandon him, and in the end, Las Vegas gets nuked. He manages to escape that and end up on a Pacific island. I wonder if that was maybe Stephen King commenting kind of on the cyclical nature of evil or what. We next encounter Flagg in a book called The Eyes of the Dragon. Now, this was kind of a departure from Stephen King's typical, horror stuff. It was meant to be like a fairy tale type story for his kids. So yeah, Flagg is the bad guy. And once again, he's not doing the dirty work himself. He manipulates a character named Thomas into poisoning good King Roland. Not that Roland. Again, his main motivation seems to be destroying civilizations. He frames Thomas's brother, the Prince Peter, and in the end, it's Thomas who destroys Flagg, and quote marks on the word destroyed, because he shoots him with an arrow, and Flagg disappears before the arrow actually hits him. So Thomas and his friend Dennis decide to give chase. Which brings us to the Dark Tower series. Now, he's a recurring character throughout the series, but we first see him in The Gunslinger, which is the first book in the series. He was instrumental in the fall of Roland's Kingdom of Gilead. Again, we see this kind of motif of thriving on destroying societies. And for the most part, until the end of the book, he shies away from direct contact with Roland. He seems to do his dirty work through a variety of characters. Nord the Weed Eater, Sylvia Pitstead, even in the retcon version, Allie the Tavern Keeper. But even Roland himself isn't immune to the manipulation. There comes a point where Flagg basically forces him to sacrifice Jake, his traveling companion, in order to unlock access to him. The final confrontation is basically a conversation between the two of them. So kind of underwhelming as far as battles between good and evil goes, but it kind of sets the stage for the subsequent books in the series. Now, Michelle, you have a theory that you kind of wanted to get into.
In the first book, I wouldn't call him a full-blown villain. I would call him a manipulator.
Okay, I'm not sure I see the difference.
People can manipulate without being villains.
Yeah, but look at his motives. Everything he seems to do is all about kind of evil ends. He wasn't the main force behind the fall of Gilead, for instance, but he was definitely behind the scenes pulling strings and making sure that a society collapses. So it's manipulative behavior for bad ends.
I would call it he's manipulating a situation to achieve his goals.
But his goal is to destroy Gilead.
His goal was to get to the tower.
Well, that gets into the subsequent books. We don't actually find that out until, I think, book 7 of the series.
But to be able to get to the tower, you have to... There's a sequence that he needs to follow to be able to get Roland to do what he does.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be easier to not destroy Gilead, not have the gunslinger chasing you, and just set out on the path of the beam, heading to the tower?
But if without Roland, he's not able to achieve what he wants to do.
But does he know that?
Yes.
You think he knows that he needs Roland to get into the tower?
Yes.
Okay, but this is assumption on our parts, and this is something that kind of lies in reading the subsequent books. This isn't something that we would know from reading the first book in the series.
That is correct. We would not know this from reading just the first book. But he knows this. The character knows this from the book.
Right, but taken at its face value, we don't know this. So I think we kind of have to evaluate Flagg's actions in the book itself. And kind of a quick note here, in the original Gunslinger book, Walter and Martin Broadcloak are two separate characters. One of them is actually Flagg. In the retcon version of the Gunslinger, they've both been rolled into one character. So it's basically Randall Flagg as Martin Broadcloak or as Walter as the situation deems it necessary. But getting back to what we were talking about, I think if we evaluate the book on its own merits, and we look at the actions that Flagg takes, once again, he's a villain. There's nothing that really points to like any noble motivations or good actions on his part. Everything he does is pretty monstrous.
I wouldn't say the conversation with Roland's monstrous.
No, but given a choice, he wouldn't have had that conversation. He only had that conversation with Roland because Roland, jumped through all the hoops and, captured him basically and forced him into the situation.
I would say, if anything, it was more of him in manipulating or encouraging Roland to go further.
Possibly, but again, this isn't necessarily something that's spelled out explicitly in the book, so we would basically have to kind of sit on that as kind of a reader theory, a little bit of headcanon. And that conversation brings us to the next book in the series, the Drawing of Three. So Flagg doesn't really show up in this book other than in a flashback scene, which ties back to the Eyes of the Dragon, because Roland recalls seeing Dennis and Thomas, chasing after an inhuman monster. So I won't spend too much time on the Drawing of Three. I think I'll just jump straight into the Wastelands. Here we see Flagg directly, and once again, Flagg's kind of playing his own games. He shows up after Roland and his quartet have defeated a band of villains in the town of Ludd. Jake had shot the leader of this band, a guy named the TikTok Man, in the head, and Flagg shows up, revives him, and gets him out of the city ahead of the poisonous gas that a psychopathic train has released. Again, if you haven't read the book series, folks, I would highly recommend it. It's a trip, and I can't do it justice. We next see Flagg in Wizard and Glass. Roland and his band end up in a world that's been ravaged by a super flu. So they make their way through the town. Again, there's kind of a feeling of like jumping through the hoops, taking the requisite steps, and they find themselves at a sham Emerald City from the Wizard of Oz. And Flagg is, of course, basically playing the role of Oz the Great and Terrible. So he tries to talk the party out of their quest, but this whole thing kind of has a side quest feel to it. It's not the main story. Flagg's not the main villain in this book, not by any stretch of the imagination. It feels kind of like a reminder, don't forget about me, I'm still here. Next book in the series is Wolves of the Kala, and in this one, Flagg only really shows up to give Father Callahan from Salem's Lot a black magic sphere called Black 13. That's it. That's pretty much all we get of Flagg in there. It's not until The Dark Tower, the final book in the series, where we actually get our teeth into some meat, if you will. But again, Flagg isn't the main villain. But we do get kind of a tragic backstory that gives us kind of a glimpse into Flagg's personality and why he's become the monster he's become. Not so much the how, but the why. There's another connection to the Eyes of the Dragon in that backstory, and I won't spoil this for you. But his plan is to basically use Mordred, the child of Roland, Susanna, and Mia to get into the tower, where his plan is to get to the top floor and become God himself. Mordred is a were-spider with telepathic abilities. He sees through Flagg's plan and ends up devouring him. As far as endings go, it's kind of anticlimactic. But again, it speaks to the banality of evil, which is kind of a recurring theme in some of Stephen King's works. And the next time we see Flagg, he appears in Hearts in Atlantis. It's not an official appearance, but there's a character with the initials RF who has the ability to become dim, and there's numerous ties between that book and the Dark Tower series. So there's little doubt in my mind that he's definitely in there. And he also makes an appearance in The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is another Dark Tower series book. That one takes place after the Wastelands, but before Wolves of the Kala. And I would definitely recommend checking that one out too. It may be one of Flagg's most terrifying appearances. And I say maybe because there's a book called Gwendy's Button Box, which I only just recently heard about, and I haven't actually read yet. He's in it, so I guess this is to be continued. Although if I'm being honest with myself, I think I want more Randall Flagg. I'd love to see another book with him in it as the villain. Or, dare I say, another book that's maybe like a detailed origin story. The origin that we got in the Dark Tower wasn't very satisfying. It didn't have a lot of depth to it.
I fully agree with you. This character has been used so much in Stephen King's books and is tied to almost every single universe of Stephen King's, and yet we don't have much background about him. And I would love to see an actual background piece about this particular character, just to be able to have a full circle of this character and just to have a full flesh of his history and background.
Well, folks, before we go back to argue about whether or not Randall Flagg is the villain of The Gunslinger, I'd just like to remind you that we are available on most places where you can get podcasts. And if at all possible, if you could give us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice, that'd be a big help. We're on Twitter at Anxietymonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkeys. You can email us at anxietymonkeys@gmail.com. And you can join us Sundays at 10 a.m. Central Time on our Twitch channel where I play old school video games and get my ass kicked.
Also, please feel free to give us feedback. We do this because we love to, but by all means, you guys are the ones that are listening to this. And if you've got something to give us, any type of feedback or any type of ideas of what you would like to hear, let us know.
And finally, if you've got a couple of bucks you want to throw our way, you can do that at patreon.com/anxietymonkeys, or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkeys. Just a quick announcement about Patreon. We will be launching ad-free versions of our episodes for our patrons, as well as bonus content available only for our patrons. Until next week, I'm Rob, she's Michelle, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.